Hello, all, and welcome to History with R&R Live. With me, as always, is Jeff Franklin. How are we doing?
Doing pretty well. It's good to be here. I'm awake and raring to go.
Well, you're doing better than me. You're set awake. Uh, all right, so
Get
welcoming
some coffee in
greetings.
you.
Yeah, lots of it. You'll have to get an IV, I think. John DeMarco, welcome, Dave G Sound. And speaking of John DeMarco, there he is.
Hello.
Oh, imagine that. Welcome,
Yeah.
John.
Thank you.
How are you doing this morning, sir?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
All right. So I'll let you introduce the topic of the week and we'll roll on from there.
Yes, if you're go to school in the United States at least, and you pick up an American history textbook, you'll get a story about how the British government levied lots of unfair taxes and other laws on the colonies, and it was this that led them to rebel against the British control, and which led to the Revolution. However, as I got older, I did a little bit more research into the subject. I found that it's not quite so black and white. So what I want to do is go over some factors that led to the American Revolution that may not paint the colonists in quite such a positive light.
You mean they didn't just throw a whole bunch of tea in the bay and then all the water and then all the guns started firing? Oh,
There's a couple of steps in the middle there, yeah.
I know. It's all yours.
Life's never easy, is it?
Nope. But anyway, to start out, just a little bit of an overview of the colonial period. That the first British colony was established in Virginia at Jamestown in 1607. And then the group known as the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts 1620. And eventually the 13 colonies were established between the 1600s and the early 1700s, where the last one was Georgia. And one thing to keep in mind when these colonies were established, that every single one of them was established under the authority of the British Crown. They all had their own colonial charters. These weren't people coming over here on their own to set up an independent state. They were all under the British government.
Yeah.
And they wanted
Right.
it that way. They wanted it that way because they wanted the protections they would have as British subjects.
Mm-hmm.
Because in particular in North America, you had the French, you had the Spanish, for the while you had the Dutch as well. So coming over under British authority granted them the protections of both of the British military, especially the Navy.
Yes.
One of the things in these colonial charters where the colonies were established was granting Britain the rights for taxation, which will become very important later on. And as an example of why the protection was important, in the 1560s in Florida, the French established a colony in Florida that was a couple of years later come and wiped out by the Spanish, who made their own settlement at St. Augustine, which is now considered the first permanent the first permanent European settlement in what is now the United States. And the reason for that is because they wiped out their French competitors when they came in. So being subjects of the British Empire was definitely to the colonists' advantage. However, during the mid and late 1600s, there's a lot of things going on in England itself that kept them rather distracted, known as the British Civil Wars, between the monarchy and Parliament. And for several years, actually, the monarchy was overthrown and replaced by a dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. Eventually, the monarchy came back, but during this time period, because of all the turmoil in England, the colonies were largely left without very much direct oversight by England, and they got used to being relatively independent. Now, by the early 1700s, this activity in England had started to settle down, and they started turning more attention back over to the colonies again. And one of the issues that was kind of one of the first direct factors were a British law that affected the colonies in a way that they complained about was the Molasses Act of 1733. But what I've read, this name's a little bit of a euphemism, considering that the act was mostly concerned with rum. which the molasses was used to make. Now, both the British, the British, the French, and the Spanish all had colonies in the West Indies that were producing rum and from the molasses. But the French and the Spanish were selling theirs cheaper. So in order for the British colonies to compete, the British passed this act with putting a tariff on rum from these other colonies. So this imposed extra expense on their other colonists and also the people in England. So in the long run, they paid a little bit more for their rum to the benefit of their colonies in the West Indies. Now, the American colonists, of course, complained that this was unfair. And in one sense, you could say it was, because it was benefiting specifically the West Indies colonies. But that's just the typical type of trade protectionism that's practiced then, is practiced today too. Like taxpayers pay subsidies to support certain industries. But like I said, this Molasses Act wasn't leveled specifically at the American colonies. Everybody in the British Empire had to pay this.
Yes.
And what it showed was that colonists could be effective at lobbying Parliament and passing a law that would benefit them. Because that's basically what happened with the Molasses Act, with effective lobbying by the colonists in the West Indies. However, the American colonists in particular decided that basically they just weren't going to pay it. Rather than paying the tariff on the molasses and the rum, they instead engaged in large-scale smuggling. There was a large coastline. It was hard to patrol. Plus, they had sympathetic, colonial customs inspectors. So most of them just evaded the taxes. And I have a quote here from an economist. I believe his name was Richard Maybury, describing the conditions in the colonies during this time period. He said, "In short, America was a huge underground economy. Here, trade was free and enterprise unrestricted. Taxes were so often evaded that for all practical purposes there were none. A person could keep everything he earned. He could save and invest and eventually have his own thriving business or farm that would provide jobs for the next wave of immigrants. Inhabited by rebellious, individualistic smugglers and tax evaders, America quickly became the most prosperous place on earth." Imagine if you don't have to pay any taxes, accumulating wealth would be pretty easy.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why there'd be lots of people coming from England into the colonies, because they knew there was much better economic opportunities. So far from being placed under the burden of unjust taxes, not only did the American colonists evade the taxes largely, they were all very economically prosperous for the most part. So they were enjoying the privileges of being British subjects because of the protection it offered them, but they basically didn't have any of the responsibilities associated with it, especially when it comes to paying for this empire, which was not cheap to maintain.
No.
I can't imagine.
Yeah. And another important factor was the French and Indian War, which started in North America, I believe, around 1754. This was just one section of the larger 7 Years' War, which was fought in Europe and other parts of the world. And it's considered in some history books like the First World War because of conflicts going on all around the world between England on one side and their opponents on the other side, such as the French and the Spanish. Now, as a result of this war, there was basically a resounding English victory. And this gained them a lot of territory in North America in particular. For example, before the war, the French had controlled most of Canada and territory to the west of the colonies. However, as a result of the war, France ceded to Britain not only Canada, but all the territory in North America, all the way to the Mississippi River. Furthermore, in the South, Florida had been under Spanish control. However, after the war, they traded Florida to Britain to get back Cuba, which Britain had captured during the war. So basically, Britain basically dominated the settled areas of North America at this point. And they had effectively removed the threat to the 13 colonies from the surrounding forces like the Spanish or the French. So one way to look at it is that the reason that the colonists considered it a benefit to be British subjects, their protection from these foreign powers, had basically been removed. So from their perspective, they didn't really need the British government anymore, because they saw the British government as just trying to control them, take their money, and so on and so forth, without the benefit of having, the protection. One of the things they complained about specifically as a result of the war was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Now, naturally, there had been lots of conflicts between settlers on the frontier and the Indians, simply since the French had cultivated a relatively good relationship with the Indians, but the British and American colonists not so much. And after the French and Indian War, when the English gained new territory, a lot of settlers started pouring into the area west of the Appalachians. And a lot of the Indians along there didn't like what they were seeing, and this resulted in something called Pontiac's War, where several Indian tribes fought back. Before this, Britain had already been working on an act, and after Pontiac's War, they decided to basically push it through because it knew it was necessary to maintain peace on their frontiers. Now, this proclamation did a number of things, and which were largely very unpopular in the colonies. One thing it said was that all the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River was reserved for the Indians. The colonists couldn't settle there. And if at some point later on, the Indians did have an interest in selling some of their lands that were west of the Appalachians, any land agreements would have to be negotiated at a government level as a treaty between the Indians and the British government, so that the colonists couldn't cheat the Indians out of their land, like things like getting them drunk on cheap rum and taking advantage of them, which had happened a lot beforehand. There's some other details from the proclamation granting the Indians certain rights as British subjects. And in some history books, it's called the Indian Bill of Rights for that reason. And from what I've read, this proclamation is still in effect in Canada, which unsurprisingly means this is one of the factors why Canada has not had the history of Indian conflict like we saw in the United States later on. Generally, there are much more peaceful relations with the natives there. Now, of course, the American colonists, as you might expect at this point, heavily complained about this proclamation because it was preventing them from moving further west past the Appalachians like they wanted to. They complained that You're robbing us of our rights because you're not allowing us to expand further west, and you're not allowing us to buy more land. Although if the area is settled by the 13 colonies at this time period, we're still talking about a huge amount of territory for, by today's standards, a relatively low population. Like the numbers I have, at the time of the Revolution, the population of a colony was about 2.5 million, including slaves. And that same area today is occupied by about 100 million people.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they were running out of room. They had plenty of space. They just wanted to keep pushing west and taking more cheap land, for their own interests. And so they didn't like that the British government was basically stopping them from doing this. For once, trying to actually treat the Indians with some degree of equality. But that wasn't going to sit well with the colonists. Despite the fact that Britain, during the French and Indian War, had gained all this extra territory, which would ultimately lead to the benefit of the colonists. Another outcome of the 7 Years' War is that even though British won the war, it basically bankrupted the government because they spent so much money on it. For example, that after the war, they had a national debt of 140 million pounds, which if you convert it to today's money, I have it written down here, it's about $33 billion.
Yeah, that's a little bit of change. Yes,
apparently it was 150% of their GDP, which is a massive amount of debt. So pay off this debt, the British king at the time, who was George III, brought in a new prime minister named George Grenville. So he had to come up with a plan to try to pay off this debt. And one of the things he did, he raised taxes to like huge levels in Britain itself. They taxed taxes on everything. However, not in the colonies necessarily. This was focused primarily on the people at home in Britain. And one thing I found in my research was that the people in Britain were paying 33 times more taxes than the people living in the 13 colonies at the time. So we know that the British is already in a dire economic situation. And add this to the fact that they recently passed this proclamation between, for the western border between the Indians and the colonists. So try to maintain peace along the border and enforce this proclamation. They're going to set up a series of forts along the border between where the colonists were and where the Indians were to try to maintain peace, in addition to protect against incursions from the French trying to come back in. And this additional expense of these forts along the border and the troops to man them would be about £200,000 to £300,000. So they're going to need funds for that too, because already they were running low on money. So they tried to come up with a way for maybe the colonists could help pay a portion of this cost, not even all of it really, just maybe a help out, since they're already paying so many taxes in England. So one of Grenville's ideas for raising money from the colonies was to impose tariffs on imports. But as we discussed earlier, the colonists were not very good about actually paying those. Apparently, Grenville looked up the grand total that they were getting from the colonies in tariffs was £1,800 a year, which was a drop in the bucket. To realize, okay, so using tariffs obviously is not going to work. They're hard to enforce. There's a huge coastline, and so on. So we decided to use something else called a stamp tax. Now, the stamp tax had already been in place in England for over 50 years at this point. So they thought it would be a good idea to introduce it to their various colonies as well. How the Stamp Act worked is that legal documents and other things like newspapers would have to have a stamp on them showing that the tax has been paid for the document. But the value of the stamp varied based on the nature of the document. Like things used by wealthy businessmen would have a higher tax than stuff like a newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
But it was considered very easy to enforce. You just look at the document and see whether or not the stamp was on it. So it would be really cheap and efficient to enforce theoretically. And like I said, it had already been used in England, so they didn't anticipate any problems with it. Grenville estimated that the stamp tax would pay in enough to pay about a third of the expenses of the troops and the forts that were on the frontiers. And even Benjamin Franklin, who was representing the colonies in England at the time, didn't anticipate any problems with it. He thought it would go relatively smoothly. And furthermore, along with this Stamp Act, there's a couple of regulations designed to make it easier on the colonies. A couple of things. One, that all tax collectors would have to be Americans from the colonies. Also, any money raised from the tax would be spent in the colonies, would not go back to England. And also, from the time of the law was passed, the Stamp Act would not go into effect for 1 year. And one of the reasons for this was so that if the colonists had a different suggestion for how they could raise the necessary money, then they were open to that as well. However,
sounds reasonable.
Yeah, I thought it sounded reasonable myself. However, the colonists did not. And they decided, no, we're not going to pay this. Earlier from the Molasses Act, they could just basically evade it by using smuggling and other means like that. You couldn't really do that to get around the Stamp Act. So instead of evading it, they just started rioting, basically. And when they didn't get their way. I wonder why that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Just a tad.
So you may have seen these images from the time of the Revolutionary period, people getting tarred and feathered. That was commonly used against tax collectors who were supposed to be collecting the money for the Stamp Act. A lot of the tax collectors, their lives were threatened. For example, in Massachusetts, the governor's house was looted and set on fire. The colonial legislatures would try to pass laws to nullify the Stamp Act, basically saying that you have no right to tax us. Now, one common phrase you may have heard in association with this is the idea of no taxation without representation. Because the colonies, whether the American or the British colonies anywhere in the world, did not have representation in Parliament, which was not unusual. No country let their colonists have representation in their government. That was unheard of at the time. But this slogan, no taxation without representation, wasn't one of the big ones at the time, actually, because even the colonists realized their population was so low compared to that of what was in Britain that even if they were given representative members in Parliament, it wouldn't have made a difference. The taxes still would have passed because they would have been in a minority. So a more common slogan that they offered during this time was that as British citizens, we can't be taxed without our consent. Even though there's nothing in the British laws that say that. In fact, like I said, no other colony would have dared to say that against their home country.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, they were asking for considerations that were not present anywhere else in the world. And even Britain, which at the time was probably the most progressive country in the world, especially with like personal and political rights, that was a bit much. But, especially since in these colonial charters, they specifically granted the British government the right to levy taxes and tariffs. However, despite the fact that that Parliament insisted that we reject the colonists' claim that we don't have the right to levy these kind of taxes, we're still going to compromise. And here's the idea they come up with, and this was partially at the suggestion of Benjamin Franklin himself, who was over there negotiating with Parliament, is that he said that the colonists object to internal taxes, like the stamp tax, but they wouldn't necessarily have a problem with external taxes. In other words, tariffs placed on imports and exports. So Parliament said, okay, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act because it caused such a fuss. They were complaining about it so much. None of the other British colonies were complaining about it, and it applied to all of them. It was just the 13 colonies that were complaining about it. But now, because this is causing such a fuss, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, and we're going to replace it instead with external taxes or tariffs. These are referred to as the Townshend Acts. This is where they place tariffs and customs on things like tea, paper, lead, and paint. So you think, oh, well, the Parliament compromised, the colonies are going to pay their taxes now, right?
Yeah, you'd hope.
No. So what they did is they changed their tune again. They said, now, Parliament can levy tariffs for the purpose of regulating commerce, but not for the purpose of raising revenue. So basically, which I think is not complete nonsense. Of course, tariffs are for raising revenue.
Well, of course, that is kind of the plan. Yeah.
Yes, the point. But yeah, so basically, even when Parliament is trying to compromise and trying to work with the colonies to come up with something that everybody can agree with, the colonies are like, no, we're not going to pay the taxes. I mean, you can compromise with us if you want, but we're just going to refuse. We'll just make up a no excuse why we won't pay our taxes, because we got used to not paying our taxes for years, so we're just not going to keep doing it.
And also, just a quick add-on from earlier, you are correct. Up here, we still have Crown land, which is any Aboriginal reserve is Crown land. It's protected by the Crown. So the Canadian government cannot just come in and go, oh, we found oil here. That's now ours. You move over there, and because it's protected by the Crown. So, yeah, we still have that here.
Yeah, I noticed there was a question. Did the other British colonies have this sort of independent feeling while Britain had its internal issues in the 1600s? Well, I imagine that in general, the any British colonies would have seen less direct oversight during the British Civil War, for example. Although it seemed, I got the impression, I'm not an expert on this, on the other colonies necessarily, but it was mostly in the American colonies where it fostered this kind of independent spirit where they refused pretty much any oversight what the British tried to impose on them later on. Oh,
Although the protection of the Royal Navy is still required.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, any privateer would have thought twice about attacking a colonial ship. They might face reprisals from the Royal Navy.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in okay, where was I? I was at the Townshend Acts. We're talking about yielding the export tariffs. Because now this was going to be much harder to enforce, of course, because as we already know, that the American colonies are largely made up of people who didn't have any problem engaging in smuggling. So in the eastern seaboard has a lot of coastline. So enforcing the Townshend Acts was required, the British to send ships over there, patrol the coastline to catch smugglers, and they had to bring in their own customs agents since they knew that the colonial customs agents, such as they weren't going to enforce the taxes. So this is going to require more effort and more expense just to enforce it, as opposed to the Stamp Act, which would be much easier to enforce. But they took this, like I said, they repealed the Stamp Act because the colonists complained about it. But then naturally the colonists complained about the Townshend Act as well. Basically, you're taxing us against our consent again, and you can't use tariffs to raise revenue, only to regulate commerce.
Yeah, us whiny Americans.
Exactly. Yes. The only thing they complained about was, you'll see a lot of times in American history books, was the idea of quartering soldiers in people's private homes. Like during the time after the 7 Years' War, Britain passed a Quartering Act, which was designed to house the British soldiers as they passed through the colonies on their way out to the frontier to man these forts we were talking about. Now, the textbooks here usually portray the private citizens being forced to put these soldiers in their homes, but that's not really the way it worked. How the Quartering Act worked was that preferably they would house these soldiers in like inns or taverns or even stables, and with compensation paid to the owners. However, if there wasn't enough room there, the Acts had the following provision. In case there's room for the officers and soldiers in such barracks, inns, eating houses, and other public alehouses, that in such and no other case, and upon no other account, it shall and may be lawful for the governor and council of each respective province to hire and make fit for the reception of His Majesty's forces such and so many uninhabited houses, outbuildings, barns, or other buildings as shall be necessary. So only as a last resort, these soldiers will be housed in uninhabited houses, once again with compensation paid for their owners. There were no private citizens had to house soldiers in their homes against their will. And I read, they talked about that a lot when I was studying American history, like in textbooks, and when I was in school. I was quite surprised to find out that it didn't actually happen that way.
Yeah, it's amazing how that happens.
It's funny how history gets rewritten.
Yes. What was the next thing on my list? So you had this. You had they were complaining about the Townshend Acts. There was the issue of the quartering of the soldiers, although it wasn't as much of a big deal as is often presented. But over this time period, more and more resentment grew up in the colonies. They were complaining, they're taking away our rights. There was an issue called the writs of assistance, which was kind of like a search warrant, only you could use it any time. You didn't have to get a new one every time you wanted to search a warehouse, for example. Which they had to do that kind of thing because of how prevalent the smuggling was and how the colonial courts would not enforce any penalties against the people who were involved in smuggling. So they complained about that. They're taking away our rights with these writs of assistance, for example. And one of the groups that was agitating during this time was called the Sons of Liberty, which is an organization run by Sam Adams out of Boston. And there were similar groups throughout the 13 colonies, basically trying to stir up trouble between the colonies and Britain because they favored independence. So in Massachusetts in particular, there was a lot of anti-British sentiment. And this led to something that is typically referred to in the textbooks as the Boston Massacre. Although, once again, it's a little bit more complicated than that, the way they often presented in the history books. It started in 1770 when a British sentry in Boston got into an argument with some of the colonists, and eventually a mob gathered around him. And so he, for his own safety, he retreated to the British Customs House. There were several soldiers on station there under command of someone named Captain Prescott. And as the sentry retreated there with these soldiers, the mob continued to grow. The mob was armed with things like clubs, chunks of ice, lumps of coal that they were throwing at the soldiers. The Captain Prescott was apparently ordered the crowd to disperse several times, but they just kept yelling louder and louder, striking the soldiers with these clubs and so on, until one of the soldiers was knocked down. And in response, he opened fire after he got knocked down. Some of the other soldiers, when they saw him fire, they assumed the order had been given to fire, so they also fired back into the crowd.
Right.
Captain Prescott immediately ordered them to stop firing because he never told them to fire.
Yeah.
But as a result, several people were killed. Now, of course, propaganda spread throughout the colonies by people like the Sons of Liberty, presented this as a massacre. How the British soldiers fired onto a peaceful protest, whereas the details of the event were a little bit more violent than that. Now, the soldiers that participated in this so-called massacre were arrested and tried by a colonial court, and they were defended by John Adams himself. And as the result of the findings of the colonial court, they were found innocent. And basically, they fired in self-defense because they felt their lives were threatened by the mob. However, despite that, this was used as another rallying cry against the evil British oppressing the poor Americans who were just, peacefully protesting.
Uh-huh.
And there was another incident involved a British revenue ship. This was in 1772, so just a couple of years later. A British revenue ship called the Gaspee was chasing a smuggler ship in the waters outside of Rhode Island. However, during the chase, the Gaspee got stuck, ran aground somewhere in the channel, and while they were waiting for the tide to go out so they could get unstuck, the Sons of Liberty rowed out to the ship, shot the captain, and set the ship on fire. However, none of the people involved in the incident were arrested or found guilty or anything by the colonial authorities. So you can see that, again, that the American colonists were using violence to protest what they saw as unjust laws by the British, and refusing basically to accept any British authority over them.
How history repeats itself.
Yes.
Yeah. You notice that.
Mm-hmm. So once again, thing is Parliament. Obviously, this is what is Parliament going to do? Obviously, these Townshend Acts are not working. They're just provoking defiance in the colonies, the American colonies, that is. All the other colonies were just paying them. So they said, once again, they repealed all the Townshend tariffs except for a small tax on tea. This was and it represented about a 2 to 3 cents extra. It's in today's money, 2 to 3 cents they were paying on a cup of tea. And that was it. That was the only thing that was left. This would only be a drop in the bucket compared to the money they needed to maintain the forts on the frontier. So the colonists had effectively gotten their way. They had thrown enough of a fuss that Parliament had repealed all the taxes except this one small one that was left. But then this leads, but the tea thing, is another issue. Even though it's just a small tax, apparently that was still too much. And this leads into something that happened in 1773. It started out as a means to try to boost the British East India Company, which was the proprietor of English colonies in Asia. So to help the East India Company compete with colonies from other nations that were competitors with England, the Tea Act gave the East India Company a rebate on tariffs on tea for several years. The effect of this was that now the legal tea being sold by the East India Company was actually now cheaper than the tea that they could get through smuggling from the other colonial powers. So this was supposed to be a win-win for everybody. It would help the East India Company. The colonists could buy legal tea that was actually cheaper, and Parliament would it'd make Parliament happy. So they could actually pay some tariffs now. That kind of thing. Even though it actually ended up being less money than they would pay otherwise. But as you may have guessed at this point, that's not how it worked out.
Yeah.
You still had people like the Sons of Liberty who were trying to stir up trouble, saying no, this is wrong, and we're not going to let them bring in this legal tea. So a lot of these British ships carrying this tea would be turned away from colonial ports all up and down the eastern seaboard. The one exception was in Boston, because the British governor there was saying, no, you're not going to tell me how to run my own colony. I'm having this tea brought in here. So now we've got a little bit of a problem here. So we have the governor allowing the ships to come in and dock with the tea, but through the influence of the people like the Sons of Liberty, they would not allow the ships to unload their cargo. So now they're just sitting at the dock. They can't leave. The governor won't let them leave without paying the customs on the tea, but the Sons of Liberty won't let them unload their tea. So the things are going to go hand in hand somewhere.
Yes.
Especially since it was a British law that if ships were docked and they didn't unload their cargo within 20 days, the customs officials could just seize the cargo and take it in that way. So this is why there was one night several citizens from Boston marched onto the ship and dumped all the tea into the harbor. Now this tea was worth somewhere between 8,000 and 18,000 pounds, which is in today's money is like $3 million.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a minor prank. We're talking about a lot of money that they dumped into the harbor just because they didn't want people to buy legal tea, and therefore basically smooth over relations with the British government. So of course, England was incensed by this. To this point, they had tried everything they could to basically compromise with the colonies. They had, in addition to providing all these many years of basically military protection. And so they passed the Stamp Act and repealed that when the colonists complained. They passed the Townshend Act and repealed that except for the tea when the colonists complained. And they had this rebate on the tea tariffs, and then the colonists complained about that too. So basically it was at this point where the British had two options. They could either basically cut their losses and turn the colonies loose, or they could try to reassert their authority. Although honestly, if we look at it at this point, it was probably too late at this point to do that. But the British had invested so much in the colonies over the years that they weren't quite ready to do that. So the British government at this point took a hard line and passed something called the Coercive Acts, which were in the colonies were typically referred as the Intolerable Acts. It did things like closing the Boston Harbor, until which point that they would the East India Company would be repaid for all the tea they can dump into the harbor, which was not a small sum.
No.
Because then once again, they're taking away our rights again. So basically, at this point, there was nothing the British can do. So this was by this point, we're into 1774, and it was the following year when the fighting started at Lexington and Concord. I guess that about wraps up what I have so far.
All right. So yeah. So basically, in the history books, it was Big Bad British. But if you go and
Basically.
like with everything else, if you look a little deeper, there was a lot more at play than just simply, well, the British were mean and kept taxing us for no reason. Um, and you find that along in history with with everything. It sounds easy and cut and dry on the surface. However, once you dig past the surface, you find that, oh, well, there's a whole bunch of stuff I don't know. And of course, that would lead to the revolution, and of course, then there's the other thing that isn't mentioned a lot in the history books is just how much the French helped. But
yeah.
Mm,
you know,
true.
because the French are still pissed that they lost that last war. But
So, John, why
Yes.
do you think the American colonies were different than the other colonies at that time? That they rebelled against all these tariffs and taxes and
I don't really know for sure, but the best I can figure is that the type of people who came to the American colonies would presumably be the type would be more independent in the first place, because not just anybody's going to come over from England to a new frontier, which because at first that would have been a very dangerous proposition. A lot of the early colonists died. So, Mike, I don't know how this is different from others. Just there was something about the culture of the 13 colonies in particular that led them to have a more independent, stubborn nature than the settlers in the other colonies.
well, I can vouch for American stubbornness.
stubborn, never. Um, I wonder too if it was more that they got a taste of how much money they could make, because for as you pointed out, this didn't happen over like a day or a month or a little while. They found out, if we don't pay here, we can make pretty good money.
Mhm.
And the problem with making pretty good money is the more you make, the more you want to make even more. So, I mean, you see it in companies, you see it even today. A company does not like to have to share the market share
Of
ever,
course.
right? So,
Right.
if they can find a way, and like we've seen over the last year, if a company is hurting with 10 people, well, we're making 22 billion a year. However, if we trim down our product line from where we have 10 people, we could get by with 5. We can increase our profit margin tenfold. So let's make the work of 10 be the work of 5. And then we'll get an extra little bit at the end of the year, and this will be good. Happens every year, happens every time. And then they go from, well, we could get away with 8. Yeah. Well, do you think we could get away with 6? And then the next year it's, well, we got away with 6. You think we could get away with 5? Because I still don't think our profit margins are where they need to be.
Yeah.
And so on and so on. So I wonder if some of it is you had certain businessmen that were like, well, wait a second. I'm making hand over fist money, but I could probably make about 10% more if I didn't have to pay this tax or that tax or pay those workers, or it's the same concept. So I wonder if some of it was, and then of course, if you have legal tea that is cheaper than what the black market is selling it for, well, that's a threat.
Mhm.
Yeah.
right? So if the black market has been built up and the black market is there, well, wait a second. That can't stand, because now I'm going to lose a whole bunch of money. So I think some of it was just came down to money. People got were threatened. Oh my goodness, I'm going to lose. Instead of making 10 million a year, I'm only going to make 8 million a year. That's unacceptable. So which is, we sit there, our 50 or 30 grand a year and go, are you on glue? But this happens even today, where we sit there and we'll see a company that makes, well, I hate to do this, but I'll do it anyway because my brain is struggling to find another company I know enough about the economics of. So WWE, look at the last year, they have record profits, but they've cut 89 superstars from the roster. And their excuse for doing so was budget cuts. So again, you have a situation where, well, yes, we're making a lot of money, but we could make more.
Mm-hmm.
And that allure is, well, okay, well, what's standing in our way? Oh, those redcoats over there. Oh, well, let's just get rid of them. And, at this point, from the British side, they've got to be going, oh, this is costing us way more money to deal with, which is probably why the tariffs got pulled. Was probably less to do with appeasing the colonists, but more, this is just costing us too darn much money to enforce here. We have enough to worry about. We don't need to have 50,000 troops over there. Let's, if we only have one to worry about, the T, then we have less troops that need to be there. So less money we have to spend. And unfortunately, it all just went off like a powder keg because you had enough people saying the right thing to the right people in the right tone of voice.
Of course,
so it sounds like a lot of it. I'm sorry, Sean. Go ahead.
That's all right. I'm saying, and of course, as soon as the revolution was over, what did the U.S. government do? Pass a bunch of taxes and tariffs.
Oh, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, they got to pay for that army, and until about World War II, they never did like paying for a navy. But so it just basically comes down to economics of, you look at taxes, and I find it funny because up here, our income tax was technically brought in as a temporary measure to pay for World War One. Well, World War One has been over for a couple of years now, and just a couple, and the income tax is still here, and it's not going away at any time soon. But, so whether we like it or not, taxes are a part of life. Whether so. Whether it was going to be the British taxing the Americans or it was going to be Americans taxing Americans, at some point there would always be a tariff of some sort.
Right.
Otherwise, you don't function because the government needs to pay for its expenditures. And the only way it can do that is to crowdfund, as it were. Except there's no optional donation. That's the only difference. But with that, I'm going to thank John DeMarco for joining us. It was very interesting and well put together conversation. I greatly appreciate it. always blows me away every time I hear how many pages of paper he's turning over. As I sit here, even when I'm doing it on my own, and I have everything, I never have
John,
paper in front of me.
John's very detailed and organized.
Yes. So I
Well,
thank you for the work you put in
Yeah, we
doing these.
appreciate it.
I greatly appreciate it. You
well,
blow me away every time you come. Just how knowledgeable you are on the topic at the time, and again, how many pieces of paper you turn over. I think I counted 7. Um,
actually, the pieces of paper we're turning over from a book, so I can't really take credit for all the research.
Well,
yeah.
you researched it.
Yeah. But I do want to thank you for that, and thanks Jeff for lining up all these great guests. I will put in a plug. Richard, I'm sorry for next week. Next week, it is the one of the only times that History with R&R will take shall we say, a turn to the left. And by that I mean next week we will have, let's see, the official titles of our guests next week is the God Emperor of Kuroga, Bird of Prey 5, and the President of Turkestan, Salty Trekker. And that should be interesting. Again, Richard, I'm sorry. It was a good idea.
Forgive us. Forgive
Yeah,
us.
forgive us.
Please.
I'll ask forgiveness instead of permission. Long story, Jeff knows. But yeah, sorry, Richard. And then we've got a couple more. I think we've got one more. Nope, that'll be the last live stream of 2021.
Yep.
And
And I figured between Christmas and New Year's, that'd be a good time to bend the rules.
Yeah, it's a good time just to do a tongue in cheek episode. So yes, next week we will welcome the God Emperor of Kuroga, who I am really hoping is doing better than he was earlier this week, last week, and so send him the best over this holiday season. And of course, Mum Prey 5, the strongest and bravest mom of us around. One, she puts up with the God Emperor of Kuroga. And for that, she should get many medals.
Yeah.
That's just my humble opinion. And then, of course, we will also have the president of Kurdistan, Salty Trekker, on, and they will be telling the origin stories of both Kuroga and Kurdistan. So this should be, if nothing else, interesting. Are we going to have like points for who comes up with a better story? I don't know how we're going to judge.
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah. We might need one of those scoreboards. We might have to talk to Conti.
Don't talk to Conti. He didn't make the scoreboard. I did.
Okay, well there we go. So we've got half rights there. So I'm sure we can pull something. And then I am waiting on a confirmation. I can say that on History with R&R. I'm waiting for a confirmation email, and once I have that email, there will be a God allowing and my fingers crossed and toes and legs and ears that this actually works out. So far, the response has been very positive, and if everything works out within the first or second week of January, there will be a very huge show, in my opinion, that I will be bringing to History with R&R, and I am just itching to have this conversation. It'll be a very special guest. It'll be done on a special day. It'll be a separate live stream, and it'll be one of those that you won't want to miss.
And don't forget about this Friday.
And this Friday, of course. Yep. This Friday will be the round table. And then the Friday after that. So no, the last live stream will be Mr. CCTV.
Oh, there you go.
last live stream will be with Mr. CCDV of 2021. And so, yes. So we've got a few things, and then also early January. I had hoped to do it in this month, but Christmas season and everything, I'm just bogged down, and I just haven't had the time to write things. So early 2022, Midway, the radio show, will be in production. So I'm looking forward to that. I do thank everyone who has ever voiced in one of our radio shows. Of course, poor Jeff almost dies, everyone, but it's part of his job. I think I put it in the job description. Must be willing
my
to
lot
be
in
blown
life.
up, sunken ships. A couple other little adjectives, but we always give him the final word. So there's that. But with that, folks, as Richard would always say, also just I have made the confirmation, so I can announce this. January the 22nd, which is a Saturday this year, we will be having a special live stream memorial remembrance celebration of Doom. It'll mark 1 year, and we will be having it. Paula Simpson will be joining us as we try to keep her in good spirits that day. As we all know, she will, above all of us, have it the roughest. So my hope is that we can all get together and we can share a few laughs, share a few stories, and help Paula get through that day. And with that, I would like to say thank you all. As Richard would say, thank you and good night.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
And Merry Christmas.